December 24th, 1914. The Western Front. Private Albert Morin crouches in a waterlogged trench near Ypres, his finger resting on the trigger of his Lee Enfield rifle. The mud is frozen solid tonight. For once, he's grateful. Better than the sucking nightmare it becomes in rain. Across no man's land, perhaps 80 yards away, perhaps less in the darkness, the German trenches wait. 4 months into a war everyone said would be over by Christmas. And here they are. Still here. Still dying. Still killing. Then, through the December night, a sound that doesn't belong. Singing. German voices, carrying across the frozen wasteland between the lines. Morin's hands tighten on his rifle. Is this a trick? Some new psychological torment before an attack? But the singing continues. Clear. Unafraid. Beautiful. And then, something happens that will be forbidden by generals, punished by courts-martial, and denied by official histories for years to come. Something that shouldn't be possible between enemies locked in the bloodiest war humanity has ever known. What happened in those 48 hours would haunt the men who experienced it for the rest of their lives. Not because of horror, they'd seen enough of that to fill 100 lifetimes, but because of something far more troubling to the machinery of war. They discovered that the monsters on the other side of no man's land were men. Just men. Men who sang the same songs, missed the same homes, and wanted the same impossible thing: to survive until they could go back to the lives they'd left behind. This is the story of the Christmas Truce of 1914. The moment when, for a brief and shining instant, humanity broke through the horror of the trenches, and the moment that both armies would spend the next 4 years trying desperately to prevent from ever happening again. What the soldiers couldn't believe then, what still seems impossible now, was that such a thing could happen at all. Private Albert Morin was 22 years old that Christmas Eve. Before the war, he'd worked in his father's shop in Lewisham, selling tobacco and newspapers to regulars who knew his name. He'd joined up in August like everyone else, caught in the fever that swept through Britain when the bands played and the recruiters promised glory. By December, glory was a word that made him want to laugh or weep. He was never quite sure which. Alongside Morin in the trenches near Ypres sat hundreds of others like him. Men from the 6th Gordon Highlanders, the 1st North Staffordshire Regiment, the 2nd Queen's Westminster Rifles, clerks and farmers, miners and teachers, boys who'd lied about their age, and men old enough to be their fathers, all of them cold, all of them exhausted, all of them trying not to think about the fact that, statistically speaking, most of them wouldn't see another Christmas. Lieutenant Geoffrey Heinecke, 24, kept a diary throughout the war. His entry for December 20th, 1914 reads simply, "Another day in this frozen hell. Lost Jenkins to a sniper. He was showing someone a photograph of his daughter. The bullet took him through the temple. He probably never knew." These were men who'd stopped writing home about the adventure of war by November. Now, when they wrote at all, they said things like, "We're managing fine and don't worry about me," and carefully avoided mentioning the rats, the size of cats that ate the dead in no man's land, or the feet rotting inside their boots, or the way a man could drown in mud before his mates could pull him out. Picture a scar running across the face of Europe. From the English Channel to the Swiss border, 2 lines of trenches face each other across a strip of devastated earth. In some places, like Ypres, these lines lie so close together that men can hear the enemy talking. In others, hundreds of yards separate them. The British sector near Ypres in December 1914 was a particular sort of nightmare. The water table sits just below the surface here. Dig down 3 feet, and groundwater floods in. So the trenches aren't really dug, they're built. Sandbags stacked head high, wooden revetments that rot and collapse, fire steps where men stand to shoot or watch. The smell hits you first when you enter the trenches for the first time. Unwashed bodies, latrine buckets that can't be emptied during daylight, chloride of lime they use to try masking the stench of death. Beneath it all, the sweet, sick odor of decomposition from the corpses still lying in no man's land from attacks weeks or months earlier. Winter makes it worse in some ways, better in others. The cold preserves the dead at least, freezes the mud solid so you're not constantly fighting to keep your footing. But it also means sentries die of exposure at their posts, and frostbite claims toes and fingers with the casual efficiency of shrapnel. December 24th, 1914, was bitterly cold, clear. A frost moon hung over the trenches, bright enough to read by, bright enough to see the barbed wire strung across no man's land, festooned with the wreckage of previous attacks, scraps of uniform, unexploded shells, and things the soldiers tried not to look at too closely. They'd been told the Germans were Huns, barbarians, baby killers who bayoneted Belgian nuns and crucified Canadian soldiers. The propaganda had been relentless since August. Posters showing German soldiers with dripping fangs, newspaper stories about atrocities that grew more elaborate with each retelling. We were told they weren't really human, Rifleman Percy Jones would recall decades later, that they'd been so brutalized by their Kaiser and their military training that they were more like animals than men, that showing them mercy would be the same as showing mercy to a rabid dog. But 4 months in the trenches had complicated that simple narrative. The Germans didn't seem like monsters. They seemed tired. When you listened at night, you could hear them coughing in their trenches, the same wet, racking coughs that plagued the British lines. Sometimes you'd hear singing, melancholy songs that sounded like the ones homesick British soldiers sang. Once, Moren had heard someone playing a harmonica across no man's land, and the tune had been Home Sweet Home. Still, they were the enemy. Men who would kill you without hesitation if you showed yourself above the parapet. Men whose artillery had turned your mates into unidentifiable fragments of meat and bone. Men who stood between you and home. The unofficial rule in the trenches had evolved into a kind of tacit agreement. We won't trouble you during breakfast if you don't trouble us. Artillery bombardments came at predictable times. Snipers took their shots, but not excessively. Both sides needed to fetch water, repair trenches, bring up supplies. A sort of ritual warfare had developed, violent enough to satisfy the generals, but not so suicidal that everyone died in the first month. But anything beyond that? Actual communication with the enemy? That was unthinkable. Court-martial offense. Traitors' work. The physical stakes were obvious enough. These men stood approximately an even chance of being dead within 6 months. The life expectancy of a junior officer on the Western Front in 1915 would average 6 weeks. For ordinary soldiers, perhaps slightly better, though not by much. But there were other stakes, less visible, but just as real. Every man in those trenches was carrying a burden of trauma that would later be called shell shock, and later still PTSD. The nightmares had already started. The inability to stop your hands from shaking. The way certain sounds, a door slamming, a car backfiring, would send you diving for cover months or years later. They'd seen things no human being should see. Watched their friends die in ways that defied description. Killed other human beings, and would have to live with that knowledge for the rest of their lives, however long or short those lives might be. And they'd done it, most of them, because they believed in something. King and country, protecting Belgium, stopping German aggression. The propaganda had told them they were fighting for civilization itself against barbarism. If that wasn't true, if the enemy across no man's land were just men like themselves, caught in the same machinery of death, then what did all the suffering mean? As Lieutenant Heinecke wrote in his diary on December 23rd, "We've lost half the battalion since August. Half. And for what? To hold this particular stretch of frozen mud? To add a few more names to the casualty lists? Sometimes I think the only thing keeping us sane is that we don't think too hard about any of it." The tension was building. Christmas Eve was tomorrow. Back home in England, families would be gathering, trees would be decorated, children would hang stockings, churches would fill with candlelight and song. All the warmth and comfort and normalcy that seemed to belong to another universe from the one these men now inhabited. In the trenches, the men tried not to think about it. Some succeeded better than others. Christmas Day 1914 dawned cold and clear along the Western Front. But Christmas Eve, that's when it began. That's when everything changed. It started with the singing. Around 7 o'clock that evening, as darkness settled over the trenches, men in the British lines began to notice something unusual. Lights were appearing in the German trenches, not the harsh glare of flares or the flash of gunfire. Something softer, warmer, candles. The Germans were placing candles along their parapets, small Christmas trees, no taller than a man's arm, decorated with candles and bits of coloured paper. Later accounts would describe dozens of these trees, their flames flickering in the cold night air, creating a string of lights that ran along the German lines. Private Frederick Heath of the 1st North Staffordshire Regiment wrote to his wife, "The Germans had placed lights all along their trenches, and we could hear them singing. It was the most peculiar thing. Here we were, supposed to be killing each other, and they were having Christmas." The singing started quietly. A few German voices, then more, until whole sections of their trenches were filled with song. The melody drifted across no man's land, clear and pure in the frozen air. British soldiers, crouched in their own trenches, weapons at the ready, listened. Some had their rifles trained on the German lines, fingers on triggers, waiting for the attack they assumed must be coming. This had to be a trick, some elaborate German plot. But the singing continued, and slowly, incredibly, some of the British soldiers began to recognize the tune. Silent Night. They knew it, of course. Every Christian child in Europe knew that hymn. But hearing it now, in German, sung by men who'd been trying to kill them just hours earlier, was something else entirely. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht, alles schläft, einsam wacht. And then something happened that no one had planned, that no officer had authorized. That would have been absolutely forbidden if anyone had thought to forbid it in advance. A British voice called out across no man's land. The exact words are lost to history, but the accounts agree on the sentiment. "We can hear you. We know that song too." And in English, from the British trenches, voices rose to join the Germans. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. Two armies who'd spent 4 months doing their utmost to slaughter each other were singing together. The same song in different languages, the words meeting somewhere over the shattered ground between them. Private Albert Moran would later tell his family that he'd wept. He wasn't ashamed of it. Half the men around him were weeping too. Something about that moment, those voices joining across the darkness, had broken through all the careful barriers they'd built to survive this war. But what happened next, no one could have predicted. Not even the generals who would later try to cover it up. When the singing ended, there was silence, a profound, waiting silence. And then, from the German trenches, a voice called out in English, "Happy Christmas, Tommy!" The British soldiers looked at each other. Was this real? Was this actually happening? Someone, history doesn't record who, made a decision that would ripple up and down the line for miles. He stood up, in full view of the German trenches, where a sniper could drop him with a single shot. He stood up and shouted back, "Happy Christmas, Fritz!" Nothing happened. No shot rang out. No artillery opened fire. Instead, more Germans stood up, then more British, men rising from their trenches like swimmers surfacing from dark water, tentative, disbelieving, waiting for the bullet that would punish this madness. It didn't come. Lieutenant Heinecke recorded in his diary, "It was as if both sides had simultaneously decided that enough was enough. that for one day, one single day, we could be human beings instead of soldiers. I saw men standing on their parapets, fully exposed, waving, and the Germans were waving back. Within minutes, men were climbing out of their trenches entirely, stepping over the sandbags that had protected them for months, walking out into no man's land, that killing ground where nothing lived and everything died. They met in the middle, British and German soldiers, face to face for the first time as something other than targets. The first thing that struck everyone was how young they looked, how ordinary. These weren't the monsters of propaganda. They were boys mostly, teenagers and young men with dirt on their faces and fear in their eyes and a desperate, tentative hope that this moment might be real. Hands were shaken. The formal, awkward handshakes of men who don't share a language but understand perfectly what this gesture means. Private Heath wrote, "I shook hands with a German fellow who looked no older than my youngest brother. He had a photograph of his family that he showed me. Mother, father, 2 sisters. He pointed to them and said their names. I couldn't understand the words, but I understood everything that mattered. Some men had brought gifts. The Germans had more supplies, generally. Better rations. They offered cigars, sausages, beer. The British shared what they had, tinned beef, cigarettes, rum from their rations. One German soldier produced a bottle of wine. Another had chocolate. These were passed around, British and German hands both reaching for them, sharing in a communion that had nothing to do with orders or strategy or national interest. They showed each other photographs, wives, children, sweethearts, parents, the universal currency of homesickness and longing. A German private showed a British sergeant a picture of his daughter, born just before he'd been sent to the front. The sergeant showed his own son's picture. The 2 men stood there in no man's land, muddy and cold and exhausted, looking at each other's children. No one shot at them. Up and down the line, for miles, the same scene was playing out. Thousands of men climbing from their trenches, meeting their enemies, discovering they were human. But that wasn't the most unbelievable part. As more men gathered in no man's land, someone had an idea. Multiple someones, actually. In different sections of the line, the same thought occurred to different soldiers at roughly the same time. We should play football. Now, the famous football match of Christmas 1914 has become somewhat mythologized over the years. Some accounts claim it was an organized game with goals and teams. Others suggest it was more of an impromptu kickabout, with whatever could serve as a ball. The truth, as historian Malcolm Brown documented from soldier letters and diaries, probably lies somewhere in between. There were multiple games, in different locations, with varying levels of organization. Private Ernie Williams of the 6th Cheshire Regiment recalled, "Someone produced a football. I have no idea where it came from. Might have been British, might have been German. But once it appeared, the game was on. We used capsticks for goalposts and just started playing. Germans on one side, British on the other, right there in the middle of no man's land. Lieutenant Johannes Niemann, on the German side, wrote to his family, "It was the most curious thing I have ever experienced in my life. One moment we are shooting at these men. The next, we are playing football with them. The English are surprisingly good players. We lost 3-2. The image is almost impossible to process. Men who'd been killing each other with methodical efficiency were now chasing a football across frozen mud, laughing when someone slipped, arguing about whether a shot had gone between the makeshift goalposts, slapping each other on the back when someone scored. For a few hours, in scattered sections along the Western Front, the war simply stopped existing. But there was something else happening too. Something quieter, but perhaps even more significant. All across no man's land, British and German soldiers were working together to bury the dead. Bodies had been lying in the wasteland between the trenches for weeks. some since the early battles of the war in August and September, decomposing, forgotten. Neither side had been able to retrieve them. Going into no man's land was suicide. The snipers would get you. The machine guns would cut you down. But now, with the unofficial truce in effect, men could finally do what they'd been unable to do for months. They could bury their dead properly. British and German soldiers worked side by side, digging graves in the frozen ground, lifting bodies, some barely recognizable after months of exposure, treating them with dignity, with reverence, regardless of which uniform they'd worn. Chaplains from both sides conducted services. German and English prayers were said over mixed graves. Men stood with heads bowed, muddy caps held over their hearts, while their enemies helped lay their friends to rest. Lieutenant Charles Bruce of the 1st North Staffordshire Regiment wrote, "I stood beside a German officer while his chaplain said prayers over 3 British soldiers we'd just buried. Then our chaplain said prayers over 6 German boys. All of them were sons of someone. All of them should have lived. This was the part that would haunt survivors later. Not the joy of the football game or the wonder of the singing, but this, the realization that they'd been killing boys who could have been their brothers, that the corpses they were so carefully burying were no different from the corpses they'd made. One German soldier, working beside Private Morin to lift a body, suddenly stopped and sat down on the frozen ground. He put his head in his hands and wept. Morin sat beside him. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. As afternoon faded toward evening on Christmas Day, reality began to intrude. Officers on both sides were becoming aware of what was happening, and they were horrified. General Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien, commanding the British Second Army, would later write that fraternization with the enemy was, quite simply, treasonous, that it undermined discipline, destroyed the fighting spirit, and could not be tolerated under any circumstances. The German High Command felt exactly the same way. Orders began filtering down to the trenches. Return to your positions. This is over. It must be over. In some sections, the orders were ignored for another day. The truce extended through Boxing Day in places, with men still meeting in no man's land, still talking, still trying to hold on to this brief moment of sanity. But it couldn't last. Both sides knew it couldn't last. On the evening of December 26th, in most sections of the line, a peculiar ritual took place. German and British soldiers, standing together in no man's land, would shake hands one final time. Some exchanged addresses, promises to write after the war. Others simply stood in silence, knowing what was coming. Then they would return to their trenches, take up their positions, load their weapons, and wait. According to multiple accounts, there was a countdown in some places, an agreement that at a specific time, precisely at a specific time, the war would resume. When that moment came, both sides fired their weapons into the air, deliberately over the enemy trenches, not trying to hit anyone, just making noise, going through the motions, showing their officers that yes, they were fighting again. But something had broken, or perhaps something had been revealed that couldn't be hidden again. Private Morin wrote to his mother, "I don't know how to explain it, Mum. I shook hands with Fritz on Christmas. We buried our dead together. We played football together. And now I'm supposed to try to kill him. How do I do that? How do I shoot at a man whose name I know, whose sister's name I know, whose hometown I know is not so different from ours?" He wasn't alone in feeling that way. Up and down the line, soldiers were grappling with the same impossible contradiction. But what happened next was perhaps the most tragic part of the entire story. The generals had learned their lesson. This could never, ever be allowed to happen again. In 1915, orders went out to both armies. There would be no repeat of the Christmas Truce. Any soldier caught fraternizing with the enemy would face court-martial. Officers who allowed it would be cashiered. No exceptions. More than that, military strategy changed specifically to prevent another truce from developing. If men became too friendly when they faced each other across stable trench lines, the solution was simple: rotate units constantly. Never let the same British battalion face the same German regiment for long enough to develop any understanding or sympathy. Artillery bombardments were scheduled for Christmas Day, 1915, specifically scheduled, deliberately, to ensure that no one would be singing carols or playing football. They'd be too busy trying not to die. The policy worked. There was no Christmas Truce in 1915, or 1916, or 1917, or 1918. The war ground on for 4 more years. Millions more would die in those trenches. The Western Front would become synonymous with industrialized slaughter on a scale humanity had never imagined. But the men who'd experienced that Christmas in 1914 never forgot it. Decades later, in the 1960s and 1970s, when historians from the Imperial War Museum began conducting oral history interviews with aging veterans, the Christmas Truce came up again and again. Old men in their 70s and 80s would begin to speak about it and have to stop, overcome by emotion. Why? Why did this memory affect them so powerfully? More than the battles, more than the horror, more than all the other things they'd endured. Perhaps because it represented something they'd lost. Not just the friends who died, though they lost plenty of those, but the loss of a kind of innocence. The knowledge that wars were fought by human beings against other human beings, and that the line between enemy and friend was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Or perhaps because it represented what could have been. If ordinary soldiers, given half a chance, chose peace over war, what did that say about the men who ordered them to fight? What did it say about the systems that made war inevitable? These weren't questions that had easy answers. They aren't questions that have easy answers now. What we know is this. For a brief moment in December 1914, humanity triumphed over hatred. Men chose to see the human being behind the uniform, and for that brief moment, the unthinkable became real. The Christmas Truce was never officially acknowledged by either government during the war. No British or German military record admits it happened, though the evidence is overwhelming. Letters, diaries, photographs all confirm it. It took decades before the story became widely known. When it did, it captivated the public imagination. Here, finally, was a story from that terrible war that didn't end in pointless slaughter. A story where humanity won, even if only for 48 hours. But there's a darker truth beneath the heartwarming narrative. The Christmas Truce happened because, at that point in the war, the soldiers on both sides still retained enough humanity to make it possible. They'd been at war for 4 months. They'd seen death, certainly. They'd killed, undoubtedly. But they hadn't been completely brutalized yet, hadn't been ground down by years of horror until they were incapable of seeing the enemy as human. By 1916, after the Somme, after Verdun, after all the gas attacks and flamethrowers and methodical slaughter, would such a truce have been possible? Probably not. The men were different by then. Harder, more damaged, less able to bridge the gap between themselves and the men trying to kill them. So the Christmas Truce stands as a kind of monument to something lost, the last gasp of an older world, before industrialized warfare changed everything. But perhaps there's another way to look at it. Perhaps it proves that even in the worst circumstances humanity has ever created, the impulse toward peace, toward recognition of our common humanity, remains. Buried sometimes, suppressed, but still there, waiting for its moment. On Christmas Day, 1968, something unusual happened at the Imperial War Museum in London. 3 men, all in their 70s, all British, met at the museum by prior arrangement. They'd been corresponding by letter for several months, trying to work out if their memories of December 1914 aligned. They did. All 3 had been present at the Christmas Truce in different sectors of the line near Ypres. They'd never met during the war, despite being within a few miles of each other, but now, 54 years later, they wanted to remember together. A museum curator asked if they'd be willing to be recorded, to tell their stories for posterity. They agreed. The recording exists in the Imperial War Museum archives. 3 old men, voices quavering with age, describing the strangest day of their lives. At one point, one of them breaks down, can't continue speaking. After a long silence, another says simply, "We saw that they were just like us. That's what we couldn't believe. That's what we've never forgotten. They were just like us." That's the core of it, really. The thing that made the Christmas Truce so profound and so troubling to the military authorities. The soldiers saw that their enemies were just like them. And if your enemy is just like you, if he misses home and loves his family and wants to survive and hates this war as much as you do, then what are you even fighting for? The generals understood this. That's why they had to stop it from ever happening again. Because an army that sees the humanity in its enemies is an army that might refuse to fight. And the war had to go on. For reasons of national honor and strategic interest, and because once you've sacrificed so many lives, stopping feels like admitting it was all for nothing. So the war went on. For 4 more years, until an entire generation had been fed into the trenches, until 9 million soldiers lay dead, until the survivors were so scarred, physically and mentally, that many never truly came home. But for 48 hours in December 1914, it stopped, because ordinary men made an extraordinary choice. They chose humanity over orders, peace over war, recognition over hatred, and they paid for it in their way. Not with courts martial, though some faced discipline. They paid with the knowledge that they'd glimpsed something better, something possible, and then had to go back to trying to kill the men they'd sung carols with, played football with, buried the dead with. That burden stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Private Albert Morin survived the war. He returned to Lewisham, to his father's shop, to the ordinary rhythms of peacetime life. He married, had children, became a grandfather. He never spoke about the war except once a year. On Christmas Eve, his daughter later recalled, he would sit by the window and look out at the darkness, and sometimes, very quietly, he would sing, "Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright." He died in 1971, 57 years after that Christmas in the trenches. His daughter found a letter among his effects, addressed to her but never sent. It read, in part, "I want you to understand something about that Christmas. We were supposed to hate them. They were supposed to hate us. But when we met in no man's land, all we felt was relief. Relief that we weren't alone in this madness. Relief that they were human too. For one day, we weren't enemies. We were just men who wanted to go home. I've spent my whole life wondering what would have happened if we'd all just refused to go back to the trenches. If we'd said, all of us together, British and German alike, that enough was enough. But we didn't. We went back, and the war went on, and millions more died. I think about that every Christmas Eve, the moment we had and lost, the moment that proved we could choose differently, and didn't. That's the legacy of the Christmas Truce, not just a heartwarming story about enemies becoming friends, but a haunting reminder of what's possible when human beings choose to see each other's humanity, and what's lost when we choose not to. The trenches where the Christmas Truce took place are gone now, ploughed under, built over, reclaimed by farms and towns. No man's land is someone's field now, growing wheat or rapeseed or whatever the market demands. But there are memorials, small ones mostly. A cross near Ploegsteert, Belgium, marks one location where British and German soldiers met on Christmas Day 1914. The inscription reads simply, "Here, for a moment, peace." Every year, people visit these memorials. Some are descendants of soldiers who were there, others are history enthusiasts, or people simply moved by the story. On Christmas Eve, they sometimes sing, "Silent night, in English and German, just like the soldiers did, and for a moment, standing in those Belgian fields under the winter sky, you can almost imagine it. The candles on the parapets, the tentative voices joining across the darkness, the impossible sight of enemies climbing from their trenches to shake hands in the moonlight, the moment when humanity broke through, the moment that proved it was possible, the moment that shows us even now, more than a century later, that we are capable of choosing peace, even in the darkest circumstances, even when everything pushes us toward hatred and violence. We are capable of choosing to see the human being on the other side. We did it once, in those trenches in December 1914. The question that remains, the question that Private Morin wrestled with until the day he died, is simply this. If we could do it then, why can't we do it now? Perhaps that's what makes the Christmas Truce such a powerful story. Not because it happened, but because it asks us to imagine what our world might look like if we let it happen again. If we chose recognition over hatred, peace over war, our common humanity over the borders and uniforms and ideologies that divide us. The soldiers of 1914 showed us it was possible. They paid a terrible price for it, returning to a war that would claim millions more lives. But for those 48 hours, they proved something that no amount of propaganda could erase, that we are all human, that the person on the other side, whoever they are, whatever they believe, shares our hopes and fears and dreams, that seeing each other as human is always possible, if only we choose to look. If you want to hear more stories like this, stories of humanity emerging in the darkest moments of history, stay with us. There are more tales from the Great War that deserve to be remembered, not for their glory, for there was precious little of that, but for what they reveal about the resilience of the human spirit, the capacity to find light even in the deepest darkness, the refusal to surrender our humanity no matter what circumstances demand. Thank you for bearing witness to this story, for remembering these men and the choice they made, for understanding that the Christmas Truce of 1914 wasn't just history, it was a possibility, a path not taken, a reminder of what we're capable of when we choose to be. Remember them. Remember what they showed us. Remember that for one brief moment, in the frozen trenches of Flanders, humanity won. And perhaps, if we remember well enough, it can win again.